All right, so starting at the top with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, we can begin to appreciate the individual structures. So this cartoon again reminds you where these structures are. I always say to students, this hypothalamus is a lot of gray matter that signifies it's a bunch of neurons here that are controllers. And then influences directly, really you see this, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So it's a mixture of neural and endocrine functions. The anterior pituitary is definitely the glandular. That's why it shows and stains so darkly on the slides. It's influenced then directly by hormones released from the hypothalamus. So they do have to dump into the blood, and they then go a short distance and target the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is actually mostly neural tissue, and that's why it's much lighter staining on the slides. And actually what you're going to see is the axons from that the cell bodies begin up here in the hypothalamus. The axons extend down into the posterior pituitary. All right, so here's the basic breakdown. We won't be talking about the intermediate zone within the pituitary, but just there is an additional area in here. The melanocyte stimulating hormone is kind of minor, but melanocytes, pigmentation in the skin. So let's focus on these, right, 6 that are very important to us in the anterior pituitary, and then 2 in the posterior pituitary. And we'll go through and look at these, but this is a nice table to come back to kind of wrap it all together. You'll notice first and foremost they are all non-steroids. So all of these, no matter anterior or posterior, are going to require some receptor in the cell membrane. And then they're going to have a variety of effects in the body, some more important really than others. All right? So here's our example of the posterior pituitary, which makes oxytocin and ADH. And this again shows you that the neurons, the cell bodies start up here in the hypothalamus and extend all the way, the axons extend down through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary and just dump into the blood directly from there. So we'd say that ADH and oxytocin are stored in the posterior pituitary. Right? So this, again, looking solely at the posterior pituitary. We don't require a releasing hormone. In fact, we're not going to use a hormone at all for the oxytocin. ADH is going to be influenced by water, so really a substance in the blood. So oxytocin is a unique and kind of interesting hormone all of it on its own, and we'll look at that as being stimulated by, again, the contraction of smooth muscle in the uterus or the mammary glands. Right? So once it's made, right, so stored again in the posterior pituitary, it will target, right, the ADH will target kidneys, sweat glands, circulatory system, right, in general, and this is devoted to water balance. Okay, oxytocin is going to target really the female reproductive system, so it has negligible effects in males, though there's more we're discovering about what oxytocin does still, but for now we're going to stick to what we really do know and know well. And we're going to come back to the effects of oxytocin later on in the semester. All right? So smooth muscle, cells of uterus, alveolar glands, again, female reproductive tract. This is our only example of positive feedback. It allows for the contractions at delivery to become closer together and more intense. That's part of the positive feedback. So antidiuretic hormone, again, it means against peeing. And so this ultimately regulates the concentration of our bodily fluids, because your blood, which is not the majority of your fluids, but your blood is exposed to all the other fluids and compartments in the body. So that includes your cells, which have fluids, and your interstitial fluids, and your lymph fluids, and your cerebrospinal fluids, and your synovial fluids, right? So ultimately, by figuring out how much water, or maintaining the amount of water in our blood, ADH is influencing and regulating the concentration of all our other bodily fluids. I said when we compared this to the nervous system that both systems have to operate with sensors, something that tells the body there's a problem. So in this circumstance, we talk about these osmoreceptors, because osmolarity, osmolality are ways of measuring concentration. chemically, right? So the cells in the hypothalamus actually sense this change in the amount of water in the blood flowing through there, and specifically the plasma, and respond to that, all right? And so here we have dehydration is a loss of water, which increases the solutes, right? So you're not adding more solutes, but by losing water, the concentration increases. And so we say there's an increased osmotic pressure in the solution, blood in this circumstance. So we're going to increase our ADH, and we're going to target, again, the kidneys, the sweat glands, the circulatory system. If you consume too much fluid, then you're going to decrease the solutes, right? And when that happens, again, concentration, decrease it. Concentration of solutes, decrease the osmotic pressure, and you will produce less ADH. All right? So ultimately, we are controlling the concentration of blood through ADH. And negative feedback, right? The level of water is the stimuli. So as soon as you have restored the concentration by not losing it in your urine, then you're going to stop making ADH. Right? And I just mentioned that to understand this better, you might realize what happens when ADH is inhibited, as it will when you drink alcohol, and in a circumstance like diabetes insipidus, in which ADH is not produced at all. And so you pee a lot. All right, the anterior pituitary has 6, and then of course we add the beta endorphins, but really the 6 are what we're going to focus on. These are completely and utterly dependent upon levels of hormones released by the hypothalamus. Okay, so here's again the cell bodies of neurons. They would dump into a circulation. They're releasing or inhibiting hormones. They would circulate very far, not very far, I should say, and then have an influence on the hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we generally literally call these hormones either inhibiting hormones or releasing hormones. And while there's a lot of releasing hormones, there doesn't seem to be many inhibiting hormones, right? And they are, again, the hypothalamus is really regulating what the anterior pituitary is doing, and then the anterior pituitary is regulating a whole lot of other structures in the body. All right, so here's our nice graphic of this, that here's those releasing hormones. Every RH you see is a releasing hormone. And then prolactin and growth hormone, right here, have inhibiting hormones as well. Right? So here's our 6 anterior pituitary hormones. And here we're just quickly showing you what they're going to affect, and here's what the effect is. So this is information that you would fill in the tables to try to really comprehend and try to keep track of everything that goes on in the endocrine system. Right? So growth hormone, just going to go through these quickly in each of the following slides, also called somatotropin. This is really important for protein synthesis and cell replication, right? As the name says, when you grow, you are quite literally adding cells or adding mass to cells, right? So regulated by the hypothalamus, so there's a growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulates this to release growth hormone, and then it shows, right, this target, right? So has an effect where adipose, right, stimulates adipose to break down fat, and that's so you can fuel these things, right? They need a lot of energy to do any synthesis. So then it stimulates bone cells and muscle cells. They take up more amino acids to do the protein synthesis, enhances the cell division, and prevents the cells from being destroyed. Okay, that's how you get growth. And then we also have a target in the liver, which helps to break down sugar. So we're breaking down fat, we're breaking down sugar, and we're really causing this growth. Now, of course, there's negative feedback shown right here, right? So we only want to produce so much growth hormone, it's very powerful, before we want to have a feedback in which then the hypothalamus releases a growth inhibiting hormone, and the anterior pituitary stops making growth hormone. All right, so thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin, definitely targets the thyroid, right? Controlled by, again, a releasing hormone. It is influenced by other things like cold and stress. It is definitely negative feedback, as most everything will be. All right, adrenocorticotropic hormone, again, this is the adrenal cortex influencing, that's what tropin means, hormone, right? So increases the secretion of hormones from the adrenal cortex, maintains the cortex, right? So its control, again, is through the corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, so controlled or stimulated by the hypothalamus. Negative feedback to maintain the levels, and this is released also in response to a decrease in cortical hormones, and stress can cause the release of corticotropin releasing hormone too. So again, there's other things that can cause this to be stimulated, but we're going to really focus on the control through the hypothalamus. We'll talk about blood glucose too when we get to cortisol. So gonadotropins, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, these are really targeting the reproductive structures in males and females, causes the growth of them, develop, and allows, right, and gonads would be ovaries in females and testes in males. So LH, luteinizing hormone, really is appropriate or very important for ovulation in females, and the secretion of both testosterone in males and estrogen, progesterone in females. Follicle stimulating hormone is really good for producing the eggs and sperm, what we call the gametes. This is controlled by one releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, so hypothalamus stimulated, and negative feedback maintains the levels. Prolactin, this is for breast milk, so we don't produce a lot of this very often, and what it does do is causes the mammary glands to develop in a pregnancy and then produce milk after the child is born. Controlled by the hypothalamus and stays inactive most of our lives, right? There's a very powerful inhibiting hormone that the hypothalamus makes. After your child is delivered, then there's a releasing factor which dominates and prevents the inhibiting hormone from being very effective. And this has an interaction with oxytocin for the release of milk. All right, we're not going to do the Kahoot because we're not in class, so I wouldn't have anybody who would respond to this. So on the next video, we'll look to see some of the rest of the endocrine structures.